the acquisition, adoption, and implementation of innovative capabilities by federal, civilian, and defense agencies. Today's conversation will be moderated by John Miller, ITI Senior Vice President for Policy for Trust, Data, and Technology, and General Counsel. We thank you for joining us for this timely and important conversation, and we look forward to your questions. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This conversation is on the record and will be recorded. Please submit questions through the Q&A function throughout the conversation. And now I'll hand it over to John to start. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks from me as well for everyone for joining. Just wanted to offer a few high-level points to frame the conversation before we dive in to the EO with Courtney and Megan. So, first, ITI has been working on AI as a major priority policy issue in the US and globally for several years. We published the first industry-wide artificial intelligence policy principles way back in October 2017, if you can believe it. So, over 6 years ago at this point, and subsequently have issued global AI policy recommendations, policy principles for enabling transparency of AI systems, most recently a policy guide on foundation models in the AI value chain, and we're working on several other matters, as well as conducting advocacy on AI in the US in various contexts and globally. So we do bring a deep expertise as well as a global perspective to this conversation. Second, even in that broader global context, it has to be said, this is an expansive EO. It's impressive in terms of its length, breadth, and scope, I think. By our count, we've got at least 4 dozen federal departments and agencies, various federal councils, advisory committees, and others that are directly implicated, and close to 100 work streams and deliverables that are teed up by the EO. The scope really speaks to both the horizontal and transformative nature of the technology, as well as its potential impact. And quite frankly, it also indicates there's a lot of work to go around. As we'll get into, one of the key questions will be, how we meet the workforce and resources needs that are teed up by the EO going forward. Third, I think it's also undeniable that the EO is a forward-looking EO, and the administration should be given credit for its efforts to try to lead the ongoing global conversation on these issues, which is happening quickly and in real time, as we all know. Just this week, we saw the release of major AI principles from the G7, the signing of the Bletchley Declaration at the UK's AI Safety Summit, and ongoing conversations continuing in the EU and elsewhere. So one of the challenges of being forward-looking, however, is that many of the models, tools, tests, standards, even people that are going to be necessary to successfully implement the EO may not exist yet. So that creates its own unique set of challenges. With that, let's dive into it. Courtney and Megan, and I'll go to you, Courtney, first. Let's start by covering some of your key takeaways, highlighting some of the beneficial aspects that ITI thinks this EO will advance.
Yeah, happy to start, and then I'll kick it to Megan. So certainly, as you mentioned, John, this is an enormous executive order. I think, there is no agency that has gone untouched. And so, with that being said, I think we can commend the USG for really, taking a whole of government approach to AI policy. In the executive order, I think there is really an attempt to balance innovation. Section 5 is very focused on innovation and competition and taking steps to facilitate innovation with, on the flip side, the need to address some of the accountability provisions and figure out how to best do so. I think with that said, this was a monumental undertaking, and so of course can be really supportive of the way in which this came to be. At the same time, I think there are areas where we're going to have to wait to see how a lot of this gets implemented. But maybe I can start with a couple of the things that we thought were particularly helpful in the executive order, that we see as being potentially fruitful to advancing AI innovation moving forward. Like I mentioned, I think in Section 5, we see a lot of really solid activities that are being directed here. For example, really reforming or focusing on reforming the existing immigration process to retain and attract top talent, including kind of looking at how to best reform the H-1B visa program. That's something that we've been perennially supportive of as ITI, and I think is going to be particularly important in light of some of the resourcing challenges that we'll see moving forward. In that same section, we also see at the NSF directed to pilot the National AI Research Resource. This is, again, something that we've been very supportive of, and certainly taking on the pilot program, I think, will be something that helps to move innovation in the right direction. I think beyond that, in section 4, we see a focus on managing critical infrastructure and cybersecurity risk related to AI. As a part of that, one of the interesting parts is, again, directing DoD and DHS to take on an operational pilot program to really leverage AI, including large language models, to identify and fix vulnerabilities in critical USG software and systems. Again, I think this demonstrates the immense potential that AI presents. Certainly, we hear a lot about the risks, but there's also a lot of potential here. So that's something that's also particularly positive. And maybe the last thing to note at the outset is just the large focus on international collaboration and cooperation, advancing U.S. leadership abroad. There's an entire section 11, devoted to this. And I think this is an area that will be increasingly important moving forward. As I'm sure many of you on the line are aware, we're a global technology trade association, so we are engaging with jurisdictions around the world on AI policy. And so, we were pleased to see that within the executive order, there was a pretty big focus on advancing kind of U.S. leadership and conversation abroad, and really emphasizing the importance of aligning approaches. So I'll stop there. Megan, I don't know if you want to share some thoughts from the public sector and government perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Courtney, and thanks, John. Absolutely agree with the expansive scope of the executive order. Really, there's a role for everyone. You can see throughout the executive order, as well as the accompanying OMB memo for the federal government's use of AI, they're really looking at a whole of government and also a whole of agency approach. So you have teams that are implicated that have a role to play, from the procurement shop, from legal, from the CIO's office. We'll talk more. There's a creation of a new position, a chief AI officer. There's implications for budget and resourcing and HR personnel. So it really reflects the government's recognition that AI is here to stay, that the government has to make investments and make changes in terms of being able to leverage this technology and really incorporate into pretty much everything that federal agencies do to support their missions. So really appreciate that recognition. We appreciate the investment, the recognition that IT modernization of the government is critical. The fact that there is so much emphasis on the use of this emerging technology is indicative of the government's commitment to modernizing its IT systems. So we do appreciate that and welcome the opportunity to support the government in this endeavor.
Thanks to you both. Well, let's dive into some of those details now as well. Courtney, I think we all agree this is big. It's broad in scope. It also gets into a lot of pretty granular detail in a lot of places. Ranging from the definitions to maybe some of the proposed requirements and guidelines, standards, and best practices for AI safety and security. ITI has long advocated to policymakers about the importance of taking risk-based approaches to AI policy. And I guess I'd like to talk about a couple of things on this topic with you, Courtney. I mean, first, why is taking a risk-based approach to AI policy so important, and how would you recommend the Department of Commerce approach its various taskings in a risk-based way?
Yes, so happy to talk about that. I mean, I think, like you said, it's very important to continue to emphasize the importance of taking a risk-based approach here. And the reason that we have advocated for a risk-based approach for so long is largely because that is one of the most flexible ways to ensure that you are able to reap the benefits of artificial intelligence, allow for continuing innovation without subsuming or creating overly broad and prescriptive regulation that will serve to stymie that innovation. And so it really allows for policymakers to take a targeted approach to really focus on the areas in which there are concrete and identifiable risks to fundamental human rights, to safety, to things like that, and really target proportionate requirements at those particular use cases and areas where there might be, increased risk. I think, we don't want to inadvertently capture technologies as a part of any sort of regulatory approach that present low or minimal risk, because you really will lose out on some of the key benefits associated with the technology if things are not proportionately divided. With regard to kind of NIST and the Commerce Department, as they are seeking to undertake the development of standards, guidelines, and best practices, many of which are outlined in Section 4 of the executive order. I think, NIST has been a really wonderful partner in working with the industry to create, for example, the AI risk management framework, which is referenced several places in the executive order. And certainly I foresee that as something that will continue moving forward. But I think as they are, thinking through what some of the measurement standards, metrics for evaluation will be, and particularly when we're talking about things like red teaming, really making sure that those standards and guidelines are tailored in a way that accounts for risk level, and risk is going to be very important. Largely because, and we can talk a little bit more about this later, but when you talk about red teaming in the security context, it seems a little bit different than the way that they're talking about it in this executive order, which is a broader set of testing and evaluation that they're discussing. And so, likely the type of red teaming that's required for, one particular application of a model might be different than a different type of application that might have a different risk level. And so really ensuring that as these standards and guidelines and best practices are developed, they are reflective of, the potential for different risk to be introduced and appropriately tailored in that way is going to be particularly important moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. And I mean, I guess maybe just to put a fine point on a couple of things you were just saying there, and just to ask another question. You point out NIST's great work in this area. Obviously, their AI risk management framework, has already been influential. It seems it is the case that the EO is also calling now for a Gen AI framework or extension of that framework. And I mean, that ties into a big focus of this executive order, which is this concept of dual use foundation models. It seems to be a key definition that's linked to various of those requirements that you were just alluding to, that the Department of Commerce is tasked to impose. I mean, just any thoughts on that definition? It was new to me, this concept of dual use foundation models, and also specifically whether you think that is, does that align with a risk-based approach in your view?
Yeah, so with this introduction of the concept of a dual use foundation model, that is new to me as well. So that is a term that we have not seen kind of in the general AI policy discourse thus far. And the way in which it's defined is at least right now somewhat broad. The executive order does introduce some measurements for kind of what constitutes a dual use foundation model. And the measurements are based on kind of compute power and compute capacity. But the EO directs NIST to kind of update these and produce kind of the technical parameters to actually define this concept of a dual use foundation model. But, I think what's important to keep in mind, and we put out a paper a couple of months ago on foundation models and their role in the AI value chain, is that, in many instances, a foundation model can be adapted for many different purposes. And so when we're talking about this notion of a dual use foundation model, I think right now, we need some more clarity about kind of what is meant by something that can be easily modified to exhibit high levels of performance at specific tasks that they outline related to national security, cybersecurity. So I think some of that is going to depend on the way in which NIST and the Commerce Department chooses to define these technical parameters and what that looks like. But I think, more broadly, I would say that there's a little bit of, at least in my view, I think they've attempted to take a risk-based approach here where, they're looking at these models that they seem to think pose, a significantly larger risk perhaps than current models that are on the market. But I think moving forward, it will be particularly important for them to clearly kind of articulate what exactly those risks are and why some of the provisions that they have introduced, for example, these disclosure requirements, which I know Megan is going to talk a little bit more about later, are the right tool to address those risks. Because I think in the absence of that, it's somewhat unclear as to exactly how this tool is, proportionately structured to the level of risk that these kind of future models pose. So, I think moving forward, really articulating that risk so that it is clear how that works will be important. And truly, in some instances, it depends, right, how the model is going to be adapted. So.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. I mean, hard to disagree with the need to really identify those risks going forward. You teased us with a reference to red teaming. So maybe we'll go a little bit deeper there. As you mentioned, I mean, I know you and I and certainly others who have worked on cybersecurity know of that concept from the cybersecurity context. So the concept of red teaming is a mature concept. Maybe the concept of AI red teaming not quite as mature. To what extent are companies already doing red teaming, and how can the government work with the private sector to leverage this expertise? And maybe I'll, a related question, and I'll try to work in one of the questions from the chat here as well. It does seem like there's going to be need for developing standards in this area for sure, around what an effective red teaming of an AI model actually looks like. I mean, I know there's a question in the chat that was maybe referenced as a joke, but it talked about kind of AI tools on the government side to actually and a capacity to ingest the things that it's getting. And I would say maybe red team reports is one example of that. And so I mean, I guess the second question is just what type of progress, if any, is being made on the red teaming standardization topic, if any, right now? And the first part again, what are companies doing from your perch that you can see in this area?
It's a good question because I think there is, an emphasis on red teaming, not only in the executive order, which I know is what we're talking about, but also in the Bletchley Park Declaration that we saw come out of the UK Safety Summit earlier this week, and the G7 principles. There is, a principle that focuses specifically on testing and evaluation with this kind of notion of red teaming as one component of that. And so I think in this context, as you know, John, for those of us that have experience in the cybersecurity world, that is a notion that I think is very familiar. But when you read kind of what red teaming is in the executive order, it does seem to be a broader set of kind of testing and evaluation practices that kind of go beyond just the security testing component, right? Seeing whether a vulnerability is there and can be exploited. You're really kind of broadening out this testing and evaluation. It appears to look at things like the robustness of models, its accuracy, things of that nature. And so, with that being said, companies are already doing, aspects of red teaming in different fashions. We have member companies that are undertaking things like impact assessments to really understand how a system will interact with an end user, things like that. They are, testing before they are putting out the model, for those things like robustness and for those things like accuracy, depending on the context in which the model is going to be deployed. But with that being said, we are a ways away from having, I think, a consistent standard for red team of AI models. And because there are different companies that are kind of taking approaches in a bit of a different way, I do think that is one of the reasons it remains so important for NIST in particular, as they are developing this kind of red teaming standard and guidance to support, again, the DPA provisions, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to really work with those industry stakeholders. So I think, there is work already being done, but, there are, I think, additional steps that will need to be taken in order to really come to consensus around what this concept means for AI models in particular, and really understand, beyond kind of the vulnerability and security testing of the model, what else does this reasonably need to entail? And are there different types of red teaming that are, for example, appropriate for different risk levels? And what does that look like?
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. And I mean, we had, I think we answered this question in the chat, but just to kind of maybe close the loop on it. I mean, there's a question about what is red teaming? I know we're talking about it, talking around it maybe a little bit. I mean, let's see if we kind of can agree on what it is. And I mean, in cyber, a red team, right, is kind of emulating an attacker and trying to exploit vulnerabilities. And I think what I hear you saying, right, is that in AI, the concept as it's being discussed in the EO, it's that, but it's also broader, right? It's trying to do other things too. Is that fair to answer that question?
Yes, yeah, that's fair. I
Yeah.
mean, the way that I
Okay.
interpreted, the term red teaming in the context of the EO was specific to not only specific to the kind of security component, but to kind of broader flaws and vulnerabilities. So that could be related to things that go beyond just the security part of the model or the model security.
Okay. Well, we will try to get to the other questions as well, but I know we want to move on to Megan here, get her involved in the conversation. So Megan, one of the more notable and novel aspects of the executive order is its invocation of the Defense Production Act to impose a series of notification and reporting requirements on companies that are developing these dual-use foundation models. At least those models that pose serious risks to national security, national economic security, national public health and safety. So I'm curious as to your perspective, particularly given you wear a procurement and government contracting lawyer hat. I'm no Defense Production Act expert. It does seem like the DPA is typically used when there is some sort of contractual relationship existing or contemplated between the government and the private sector. So I wonder if you have any kind of thoughts or reactions to the use of the DPA and what the implications of this provision are.
Yeah, absolutely, John. Well, I am with you in not being a Defense Production Act expert. Did have to, do some thinking about this one. It quite frankly does raise quite a few questions for not just me, but I think for a lot of people who are looking at the use of this authority in this way. I think it's fair to say that it's a bit of an unprecedented use of the DPA, both in terms of the breadth and then also sort of the intended outcome here. But first going into, what is the Defense Production Act? It's a 1950 law that, was Korean War era, essentially used to ensure, safety and robustness of supplies, critical items, critical services in times of emergency. It's a very high level, quick summary, but really the goal is to incentivize and to ensure reliability and availability of emergency capabilities. So things that are affecting life, human safety, property, things like that. I'll note that the Biden administration has used or invoked the Defense Production Act several times, so not just in this instance. A couple of recent cases where the DPA was used by this administration were, of course, related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in that case, the DPA was used to prioritize orders, contracts that the US government had with manufacturers of ventilators or PPE, things that were in really short supply and really important for a very specific health and safety purpose. So essentially moving those orders for the US government's requirements to the front of the line ahead of commercial customers even. There are a couple of other instances. The DPA has also been invoked by this administration for the production of electric vehicle batteries, and then also for the production, if you remember, the baby formula shortage. So just critical need for this very important product to promoting public safety purposes. One thing that's interesting, in addition to the fact that those are sort of discrete product production use cases, in that case, the DPA was used, as I said, to accelerate orders or to prioritize the federal government as a customer, as a consumer of these critical items, again, for that public interest role. Here in the AIEO, though, it's a little different in that, from my reading at least, and I'll talk about the OMB memo as sort of a separate entity, but from my reading of the AI executive order, the invocation of the Defense Production Act does not in and of itself require a contractual relationship between the federal government and private industry in order to require some of these reporting requirements, including the result of sharing the red team processes and outcomes there that Courtney was talking about. So it's very broad in scope, assuming that, there's not this threshold requirement to be a federal government contractor to be required to provide this information. That could really hit everyone. It could hit everyone who's providing these kind of covered technologies within the US, whether or not, they are actually contractually obligated to do business with the government. So very broad. It's also, it's and generally when the DPA has been invoked, it's designed as an incentive to companies to do those things I talked about, like prioritizing the government's requirements and ramping up production. Here, the incentive, as far as my reading, is to ensure a continuous supply or access to safe and reliable AI, that can be leveraged by the government, but also by commercial customers. So it's a little different in terms of, the intended sort of public safety nexus there and the outcome, and really what that incentive is intended to be. What incentive is the federal government providing to industry, to comply with these pretty strict reporting requirements. I mentioned the OMB memo, so I'll just add that the OMB memo does contemplate requirements largely mirroring what's in the broader EO for federal government contractors. It does task OMB within, I think it's 180 days, coming up with a way to ensure that the AI reporting requirements are incorporated into federal contracts. So we would expect to see, some sort of additional communication from OMB. It's unclear how federal agencies are going to handle this. Hopefully there's some consistency in terms of issuing class deviations, mass contract modifications, things like that. But that's another question we have about how is this actually going to be implemented into existing contracts to the extent that those requirements apply.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. And you kind of I guess you talked about both the DPA and got into the OMB memo. I mean, maybe just to well, first of all, I mean, Courtney, feel free if you have any additional comments on the Defense Production Act front.
I mean, maybe
to just jump. Yeah, go ahead.
One point, I think, Megan, you provided a really good overview of kind of how this authority has been used in the past and kind of the way in which it's at least articulated in the executive order appears to be much broader than, just federal government customers. And I think that's something that's really notable and worth kind of highlighting, particularly because I think right now there are, a lot of unanswered questions regarding, the information that's being provided. I think, I mentioned this at the top, but in terms of kind of what the specific risk is that, the government is trying to address, I think that needs to be, a little bit more clearly articulated, because right now it's not particularly clear, at least to me from the read of the executive order, what the intent is with this information that they're collecting, and kind of what happens once the government receives the information. Are they then able to step in some way? Kind of what happens with it, and then how are they protecting it? I think there are just some questions about what's actually being done with the information that is then being provided. So I think that's just an area that we would hope to see, clarified as we move forward with this.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I mean, maybe just to close this out. I mean, it's also, as I think you both mentioned, it's fairly broad in its application potentially. Seems to be talking not only about companies that are demonstrating that are actually developing these models, but are intending to develop these models, and it's a pretty broad list of reporting requirements that even includes things from other areas, like disclosing vulnerabilities, which is obviously an active conversation in the cybersecurity context in a number of different ways. So I think that's probably going to be one of the interesting areas for to keep our eyes on collectively as we go forward. So Megan, I know you did mention the OMB memo. Maybe just to talk a little bit more about the government's use of AI. There is a question here. I think we may have. I think we may have. You may have hit it already about what exactly we kind of expect to see from a government approach, but I guess maybe just even widening the aperture a little bit. Do you think that what is kind of set forth here is going to positively impact the government's use of AI and maybe more broadly even the modernization of IT systems? I don't want to lead the witness, as it were, but I think that is hopefully that will happen, because that's something that we've been advocating for a long time as ITI, right?
Yeah, that's definitely the goal. And as I started in my, remarks about some of the benefits of this executive order, just the fact that the government has put so much effort into prioritizing, the use of AI, how it's going to be used, providing that sort of framework, attempting to provide some guardrails that both the public sector and the private sector can rely on as this technology advances. I think that's very positive. I think that having that in place will provide, hopefully some of that consistency, managed expectations in terms of, what the government can expect from industry, what industry can expect from government. Still have, as I mentioned, a lot of concerns about the details. Just to circle back to that contract piece that we were talking about, typically when you talk about material terms and contracts, you have very defined expectations in terms of the schedule, the place of performance, the scope of work, what's going to be required, the price, all of those just kind of basic things so that everyone knows what they're getting into. I'm not seeing that kind of specificity here in terms of just this government requirement to industry, to provide this information for, potentially a wide array of yet to be defined uses once they have that information. So I would be looking for some more specificity in terms of those expectations. And I think that the OMB memo is interesting and does amplify and go a little bit more beyond the details of the EO itself. In terms of defining different types of government use cases of AI. So it introduces some terms, two specifically I'm thinking of rights impacting AI. and then also safety impacting AI. You can look up in the memo, there is a very long list of potential government use cases for the technology that falls into those two buckets. Rights impacting AI, just for information, would be things that impact civil rights, civil liberties, privacy, equal opportunities, equal access to government services. And then safety impacting AI, so that's things impacting critical infrastructure, functions that would have an impact on, you know, human life and safety, or the protection of property, clean drinking water, for example. It's a safety service that the government's providing. So the government's really indicating, by being so broad in what it puts in that memo, I think it's showing sort of the breadth of how they're thinking about using AI in the future. Again, ideally under, you know, very specific contracts in terms of, you know, clear expectations. But they're really showing their hand in terms of, you know, AI is potentially limitless in terms of its application to government functions as we know them today. It has the opportunity to widely influence, widely scale, advance the government's mission. And so I think that's a good thing ultimately, in terms of just the government is being creative and being, you know, they're not putting boxes around how they're thinking about using this technology now and in the future, which is encouraging.
Yeah, thanks. And you know, I'll use that. One thing you just said was that, you know, the kind of the government's contemplated uses of AI seem almost limitless, right? And it's a good segue to maybe talk a little bit about resources, which are not limitless, unfortunately, for the government or for the private sector or anyone else, when it comes to AI. I mean, so you know, I think the AI, you know, correctly seems to be anticipating that there's going to be a need for more qualified, trained AI personnel, really across the board. You know, the EO references, you know, the need for hiring surge across the government. As you mentioned earlier, talks about, you know, creating and filling these new senior positions, these chief AI officers. So, you know, from your perspective, Megan, and then, you know, Courtney, certainly happy to have you jump in here as well. You know, how should agencies be thinking about staffing and organizing to implement and adopt this, you know, very aggressive set of contemplated uses in the EO from top to bottom? You know, what are the challenges and what are the opportunities for the government, both to do this itself and also to work with the private sector?
Yeah, absolutely. We keep going back to this theme of how broad, you know, the executive order is, but that really, you know, does illustrate sort of the need for professionals, you know, across all disciplines, across both the public sector and the private sector. And, you know, although we haven't, you know, gotten into it as much in the field of AI, I think it builds on some of the themes we're seeing in the field of cybersecurity, for example, where, you know, it's no secret that there is a shortage, and there's projected to be even more of a shortage of skilled and diverse qualified personnel who can fill these critical jobs. And that's, you know, technical jobs as well, in terms of just working with the core technologies. It's also policy professionals. It's contracting officers, which are very close to my heart. It's executives. It's people at every levels of the spectrum. It's also just creating this technical and digital competency and literacy across the general public to be able to interact with these technologies in the way that they're going to need to fully leverage them. So I think the government should be concerned about the resourcing that they're going to need both now and especially more in the future. The need is just going to grow. The time is now to be thinking creatively about how to grow that pool of talent, how to interact with underserved communities, and to increase pipelines of individuals, you know, that may not traditionally be represented in these fields. I think that's critical. I know our members are doing a lot of thinking and a lot of work in terms of increasing that pool of skilled, diverse talent. And that's something that's just going to continue. So, we'd like to see it starting at the college level, at the K through 12 level, in terms of, STEM and encouraging that development of professionals. But I'd say right now there is a concern. There's a concern about the federal government, unless it makes real changes, being able to attract and retain the talent that it needs to accomplish these goals. We mentioned the chief AI officer position. That's obviously going to be a very senior position. Agencies, many of them have a chief information officer, a chief privacy officer. Many have a chief data officer now. It's unclear if one of those positions will be able to take on this role of the chief AI officer, or if that's another billet. We'll certainly, if it is a separate office, we'll want to see a lot of close coordination with the existing senior positions. But resources are probably going to be one of the government's main impediments to accomplishing the ambitious objectives here.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. Courtney, maybe I'll try to. There's another question that's been in the chat for a little bit, and I addressed it somewhat in the opening, but maybe I'll tie it in with this topic. I mean, there's a question about, I think a forward-looking set of definitions and the nature of the EO, talking about, things like labeling and watermarking and model testing. And the question is essentially like, why do we think that, the EO took that approach? And I mean, I think it's directly related to this question of resources, because it does seem to be kind of a regulatory capacity issue, perhaps, or even just an AI capacity issue. We're talking about very forward-leaning concepts, and the government, I think, is trying to be out front in the discussion. But do you think that there's any how do you kind of answer that question? Is it just a personnel issue, or is it also a question of, we're trying to work on these issues at the same time they're maturing? And maybe you're doing a lot of work with the companies who are at the forefront of the AI conversation. I don't know if you might be able to comment on the fact that they're also having difficulty hiring people, quite frankly. So it's not really just a government issue, is it?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I think, like Megan referenced, it's not just a government issue, right? We're seeing it in the cybersecurity space. I think we're going to face similar challenges in the AI space. And I think AI in particular, right, is going to require such a multidisciplinary approach. So it's not just, as Megan was noting, the technical professionals that are going to be needed that kind of understand the intricate details of, the actual technology itself, but also those professionals that are engaged in kind of, perhaps less traditional STEM fields, but that are going to be equally as important to advancing AI responsibly. But I think, to the other question that you raised with regard to some of these kind of nascent or evolving technology areas that are referenced in the executive order, I mean, I do think that there is some recognition on the part of the administration, right, that there are kind of these various efforts in process. We do have member companies that are working on things like standards for watermarking, that are working on various, content authentication initiatives. And so I think, the point of potentially specifying some of these things in the executive order is to demonstrate that, there's an understanding that these things are out there, that they might be, useful tools in the future. But I do think because they don't yet exist, it's a bit of the cliched building your plane as you're flying it, where, some of these things are going to be happening in conjunction with each other. And I do think it's a bit early to 100% say, this is going to be the solution to, the misinformation challenge, for example. I think, watermarking, like we said, that is certainly one possible tool to address it, but it's really going to be much broader than that. And so I think there are some important things that maybe weren't articulated in the executive order beyond just kind of, okay, this is the one solution that we're going to look at. I will say they reference this idea of taking stock of everything that's out there on the content authentication front, but really, I think there needs to be some additional work done to advance that, for example, in a meaningful way. So I think, it's an evolving conversation, and I think that's some of what you're seeing in the executive order is an attempt to address that as it's happening.
Yeah, thanks for that, Courtney. We've got a couple of questions in the chat which are actually aligned with the topic I know we wanted to move to next. And this is the last one we were planning on covering. But I did want to talk a little bit about the global conversation and where the EO fits into it. I know well that you and I and others have been working on these issues globally for years now, and there's probably never been more going on, it seems, than literally right now on the topic of AI. A few things that I would be great if you could maybe provide some context on, and your thoughts on how the AI EO fits in, and will or won't influence, or how it fits together with some of these things are, one, the AI Act in the EU has been probably the most prominent thing, maybe prior to this week, happening globally on AI. But then this week we also saw both the release of some AI principles by the G7, as well as the UK Safety Summit happening, and a declaration emerging from there. And I guess for good measure, someone asked in the chat about the TTC, and is that actually part of the mix here as well? So just curious if you have thoughts on the AI EO, and how it interacts with, or doesn't, any of those four things that are happening globally.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I feel like this has been one of the most wild weeks in AI since we had, chatbots come onto the scene. Hard to believe that, I think, was only 9 months ago now, but there has been a lot of activity in AI policy this week. And it's a good question, right? Because I think, a lot of folks are looking at this executive order and seeing it through the lens of all of the other things that are happening worldwide. And I think, what this EO represents is kind of a key marker for the US in moving AI policy forward. And it allows them to, I think, communicate a vision for how they are intending to approach some of the key challenges and opportunities in the AI policy conversation. But at the same time, it's only one piece of the puzzle. You mentioned the EU AI Act. This is not the same thing as the EU AI Act. That is, a comprehensive regulatory framework to manage risks stemming from AI. Right now, they're still in the trilogue negotiation process, but this executive order is different. There are some regulatory components that are either administered in the case of the DPA provisions, but contemplated in the case of some of the know your customer infrastructure as a service provider requirements moving forward. So there are some regulatory components that are considered, but it's certainly not kind of a one-for-one same thing as the EU AI Act. That being said, I think this, like I said, presents a vision for how the US kind of wants to show up in these international conversations for them. It's somewhat early. We'll see how all of the various work streams are implemented moving forward. I think, many of these things are not taking place for 6 to 12 months down the line. And so some of these reports, for example, on model weights and on content authentication and things of that nature, are things that are not going to kind of be undertaken immediately. And so, we'll kind of see what the outcomes there are and how they influence. So it's a little bit challenging to say at the moment. But I think overall, it's clear that the US really wants to be a strong voice in the conversation. And with that being said, it'll be very important for the US government to continue to work with industry and with interested stakeholders as they are really seeking to create this kind of thoughtful approach to AI policy, and then seeking to leverage that in the conversations that they're having overseas. So those are some initial thoughts. Hopefully that helps. I didn't talk about all of the various other initiatives, but I'm happy to talk about G7 or anything else to the extent it's helpful.
Yeah, if we talked about everything, we would have scheduled this for a few more hours, probably, Courtney. But we are drawing to a close soon. I do not see any other questions in the chat. So maybe I'll take the opportunity to just ask Megan or Courtney if you have any parting or closing thoughts before we wrap up, or is there anything that you were hoping we would get to that we didn't get to that you want to share with the audience?
I'll let Courtney have the last word, but just want to say that, I do think this is an exciting time. I think that, we're finally seeing the government embrace some of the reforms that we've been pushing for in terms of the use of modern technologies, turning to the private sector for these critical solutions that the government needs. So we're encouraged, and like I said at the beginning, look forward to supporting the public sector on this important endeavor. But thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Courtney.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think, maybe just to foot stomp what I had said previously, a lot of this is going to be on a longer time horizon, right? So I think it's important to keep in mind that, this is certainly an important piece of policy. And, it is, I think, like I said, a marker, but it is only one piece of the puzzle, right? This is executive action. There may be additional ongoing activities that we're seeing come out of different branches of US government. And so, important to keep in mind that this is one piece of the puzzle, not the only piece of the puzzle. And truly that I think, lots of this is going to be kind of an iterative and lengthy process, which is okay, because I think there is a lot of investigative work that needs to be done on some of these issues. Like I was referencing before, a lot of the techniques and solutions are evolving, and so taking a thoughtful approach and working with stakeholders is really going to be key to advancing this moving forward. So with that, I think I'll close there. But
Well, thanks to you both. Certainly thank everyone for attending. One thing I'm sure of is this will certainly not be the last word on the AI executive order. It's really the beginning of a conversation, and it's a much larger conversation, as Courtney suggests. ITI, we will do our best to continue to be in the middle of that conversation. We certainly invite audience members who are not already doing so to follow us as we continue to issue more analysis and guidance on the AI, EO, and related global developments. So with that, I guess I will officially close the webinar. Thanks again, everyone, and stay tuned for more AI developments.